about researching this. It's always about lifting the hood and looking what is the reality on the ground. I'll say something that might shock a lot of people, but basically in the Persian period, we have thousands of documents from Yahwistic/Jewish sources. So when I look at all of this data, all of it together, there is literally zero evidence for any knowledge and any familiarity with the Bible throughout the entire period. Historically, it is so clear and so conspicuous that up until the library was established late tail end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria, up until that moment, we see zero evidence of any type of knowledge of the Bible anywhere in any of the Jewish diaspora, whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Judea, Samaria, etc. This changes at the beginning of the 3rd century so clearly. We start seeing those names appearing in the Keteos of Abdera, or whatever text that we have there. People start knowing something about the Bible, referring to the Bible. But you see elements like that. You see Anat Yahu, the goddess Anat Yahu. It says that they brought an offering to Yahweh, and the line under that says that one Atrodan, that they had an Atrodan there. Now Atrodan today in Zoroastrianism is an Atashdan, but that is the fire holder of Zoroastrian cult. So in their temple, in the Yahwistic temple, they had a fire holder.
Is that an Avestan term that you just used?
Yeah, it's an Avestan term.
That's not a Semitic thing. That's an Avestan thing.
Absolutely. Wow. Major people who were called Magush, and one of them was Moses. How Moses was an alchemist, and, to make nature do what he wanted. But also that Moses was the teacher of Orpheus.
My special guest today, Professor Gad Barnea, who is a lecturer at the Department of Jewish History and Biblical Studies at the University of Haifa, as well as a research fellow at the Bible in its Traditions, a research project and flagship in the field of digital humanities. Barnea's scholarly focus is directed at researching and teaching the evolution and character of Yahwism under the Iranian Age of Empires, from the rise of the Achaemenid Empire to the fall Sasanian Empire. Specifically in the realm of cultic practices, Barnea's scholarship examines the dialogue and symbiosis of early Zoroastrianism and Yahwism, or early Judaism. The Iranian Age of Empires was instrumental as the historical and ideological background for the composition, edition, and redaction of the Hebrew Bible, which took place in the Hellenistic period. Yes, you heard that right. According to Dr. Barnea, the Bible that we have in our possession is a product of the Hellenistic period at the library at Alexandria, which produced the Bible, the apocryphal text, early Christianity, and the so-called Gnostic writings, as well as rabbinic and early mystical Judaism. We're going to talk about all that in this video. Buckle your seatbelts, because you're going to want to strap in for this one. And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined with Professor Gad Barnea, all the way out. You're over in Israel right now, if I'm not mistaken, right? And Haifa University. And yeah, your work is really fascinating, because things that I've stumbled on in the couple of years that I've been doing this channel and talking to experts in the field like yourself, one of the things is the question of what was going on in these different temple periods. We call it the first temple period, built supposedly by Solomon. And then there's a second temple period, supposedly when they come back from Babylon. And you have a book coming out that a lot of people are really waiting for, me myself. Link's going to be in the description. Where it's coming out in a couple months, I think. Is that so? A couple months?
It's slated to come out on November 4th.
Yes. Okay. So only a few months away, and I'm telling all my followers, get this book, because it's going to shake some things up in this discussion. And the topic of this book is, what was Yahwism like under the Achaemenid period, the Persian period? And so And so what are some of the misconceptions that people think about this time period and what was going on with, and why, and also why do we call it Yahwism and not Judaism?
Great. So two great points, great questions. So the first, I'll start with talking a little bit about Yahwism. Yahwism is a cult. I mean, speaking of religion for that period, I mean, the word religion doesn't really apply to that early period. By religion, I mean a system of rules to follow, observances, and things like that. So I use the term cult. So Yahwism is a cultic system where the head of the pantheon, the main deity is, but not the only one, is Yahweh or Yahu as they wrote it. That is really the simplest definition, is simply people who adhere as their main ethnic deity to the deity known as Yah or Yahweh. That's really the simplest definition, and it's a pretty good definition because there wasn't really a lot more to it at the time. Okay, I'm putting the biblical image of that period aside from now. I'm talking purely from a historical perspective or archaeological perspective and things like that. And so the Yahwism at the time was simply people who had their main ethnic deity, but I'm stressing that the main deity, not the exclusive deity, main deity, Yahweh. But they certainly believed in other deities as well, in local deities, in imperial deities, and things like that. They certainly believed that these other powers, supernatural powers, have power over their own lives. And so Yahwism is really just a form of cultic adherence to the deity known as Yah, but with no specific observances and things like that. Now, what's interesting, many scholars and certainly many lay people who are interested believe that Yahwism morphed into Judaism later on, became more specialized, adopted the features that we now associate with Judaism, and that's not the case. Yahwism kind of spawned Judaism off, okay, and by extension also Christianity and other Samaritanism and things like that. But Yahwism continued full force at least until the fall of the Roman Empire. So in fact, what is absolutely fascinating, and it's another book I'm working on, is that that if we were to travel back in time 2,000 years or even less, even 1,700 years or so, to the Roman Empire, and wanted to know what is the form of Yahwism that is most popular, most well known, it wouldn't be Judaism or Christianity, it would be Yahwism. And we see that in many thousands of amulets and magical items and things like that, medallions all across the Roman Empire, where Yah in the Greek, okay, Iota, Omega, yeah, exactly, with Alpha Omega.
I run into this a lot, and it's a big topic on my channel. So yes, please.
But that is a form of Yahwism, because the head of the pantheon is Yah. And that continued alongside Christianity, alongside Judaism for centuries. Of course, in your channel, I assume that you have that. You see that a lot in your channel. And if we're talking on the so-called Gnosticism, which is a term that I don't like, it's not a scientific term to call it Gnosticism. That's not how they identify.
I've established that a million times. It's an umbrella term. It's like, yeah, it's
your viewers are familiar. Yeah, great. So Gnosticism, in a sense, is an outgrowth also of Yahwism, an expression of Yahwism as well. There's a big discussion, as you probably know, whether Gnosticism has any Jewish roots in it, or is it only a Christian phenomenon. Actually, in reality, it's neither. It's just a continuation of Yahwism over the centuries. Yahwism simply was the greater force in the kind of cultic community that worshipped Yahweh. It started much earlier, continued while Judaism was being developed, and Christianity, and continued until at least the fall of the Roman Empire. But we can also, in a sense, it continues to this day. So, for example, in Kabbalah and things like that, it continues in a sense. Yahwism continues to this day. I'm sure we won't have time to get into that, but that is the fundamental form of early Judaism. What will be? I mean, again, early Judaism is not the correct term, but what will also spawn off Judaism later on.
Okay, so there's a few different directions that I want to go. Just
before we do that, excuse me, I just want to make sure something clear. It's not my book. It's an edited book, so it has a lot of different authors in it. I just edited, and I have also a chapter in that book. But I edited together with Professor Reinhard Kratz from Göttingen University. So it's not just me.
Well, even better, more expertise and more opinions. I love it. I always love books like that, or papers that have multiple people involved. Those are good stuff to read.
Yeah, we have really, top leading scholars. Conrad Schmidt, Margarita Vollmer, Tony Holm of Penn State University, Stefan Schorsch, and many others. Karl Vanderton, of course, Reinhard Kratz as well. So you really, in this book, you have truly the leading scholars in the field coming together. Initially, it was a conference that I organized at the University of Haifa at the end in December of 22, and the book came as a result of that. It's not a proceedings book. It's not just a collection of the papers that were presented. These are papers that grew out of our interactions at the conference. The conference was kind of a workshop. And we interacted a lot during the conference and even later on to think together through all of these issues that concern the Achaemenid Empire and the Yahwists at that time to produce this volume. Okay, so it's of course I'm biased in a sense, but it is a truly a groundbreaking book.
We all have our biases, but no, I can't wait to read this. So here's the two things that I want to get into. One of them is elephantine. Another one is that you mentioned this Yah-O, this 3-letter Yah-O or Yahoo. And in the Greek, so I actually have a screenshot that I had prepared, and it's from what we found in Qumran. I think Qumran. Qumran. Okay. And this is predates all these church Septuagints, the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Alexandricus. And it shows you right there in Deuteronomy, I think. Is this Deuteronomy?
Leviticus.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Right there in Leviticus, you have the name Yah-O. And so there's that. You also have in Aramaic, you have Yahoo on these coins, and this is Persian period, I believe. And so there's 3 letters, and we're all used to the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of Yahweh, or we don't even know how it's pronounced, actually, just kind of guess. Some say Jehovah. If that's all totally more modern way to say it. But I'm wondering, because there's a lot of theories on this name. Now, there are some who points out, Diodorus of Sicily says this is the name of Dionysus. There's actually a text in the Chaldean Oracles. I actually screenshotted it. It's the English translation, but it's the Thomas Taylor translation of the Chaldean Oracles. And he says, and right here I circled it, and I'll read it out just in case you can't see it. He says, Dionysus or Bacchus was called by the Chaldeans Yah-O instead of the intelligible light. In the Phoenician tongue, he is frequently called Sabaoth, such as he who is above the 7 poles, Demiurgus. Are they wrong? Oh, and then one more thing I want to point out. Plutarch in the early 2nd century also says that Yahweh, or the question in his text is called, who is the God worshipped by the Jews? It's one of these dialogues that he puts together with Ammonius and a couple other people that he's with. I forgot their names, but there's a whole list of them. And he's like, who is this God that the Jews are worshiping? He goes, it looks like to be like either Adonis or Dionysus. And he gives a bunch of really good arguments of like the similarities between the ways the priests and the Eleusinian mysteries dress. They have the same colors. They have the same tassels hanging down. They play the same flutes. They do psalms, all this stuff. I'm like, whoa, this is actually I was expecting to hear a really like kind of a weak argument of why they think that. But it was Plutarch lays it out, and I'm like, I wonder what scholars think about this. And you don't hear about it a lot. Now you've been digging into this from the expert, from your expertise, from a scholarly position, looking at the facts. How do we sort this out?
So two things. I mean, first of all, that's really appeared much later than the book that we're talking about. So so I will talk about this very quickly, but then I'd like to refocus our discussion on the Achaemenid period. But the points that you're making are important and interesting, and of course very 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 apropos as well to the development of Yahwism. You did not mention also Macrobius.
That's later. I didn't want to go too late.
Well, but it's the same. It's exactly the same vein. I mean, we are talking later, but Macrobius, you're right, it's later. But the way he's actually quoting a text from the 2nd century.
Yeah, it's right here.
So,
right here.
Yeah, right.
He says this Yad Ya'o. I'll read it out for people so we can all be on the same page. He says, the Orpheans calling Eubolia good counsel, point to this God having been provided for. If the plans of the mind are born of conception, the authors think that the mind of the world is the sun, from which the principle of understanding flows into men. They believe that the sun stood before the merit of good plan. Orpheus clearly pronounces that the sun in this free verse. And then it says in Greek, Helios on Dionysus, Epiklesin, Keleusian. And then he says under that right underneath that, he says one Zeus, one Hades, one Helios, one Dionysus. And then this is the part that you're getting into. He actually names this syncretic god Ya'o, the 3 letters that we just talked about. And he cites this oracle of Apollo Clarius, who's basically saying that this god is like the supreme god. Okay, so now we're getting later in time, but as you mentioned, he's citing earlier sources. This is something that I've been talking about on my channel for a while. So all right, now we have everyone on the same page. Now
this actually goes back to the point I was making. Yahwism continued. This is an evolution of Yahwism. And
the last thing, the Greek magical papyri, Ya'o is all over the place.
Over the place.
Every single passage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm saying, if we were to go back in time, 1700 or even 1600 years back, or of course 2000 years back, and we wanted to know what is the most popular form of Yahwism, of the deity Yah. Where is this deity being most kind of worshipped, or for lack of a better term, it would not be in Judaism or in Christianity. It would be much more. It not only were Yahwists in a sense very popular. Now, the reason I'm saying in a sense is that this was nothing was exclusive at that time. You could believe in your magic amulets and texts and things like that, and curse text, that Yahweh is going to protect you, but at the same time go and offer sacrifices to Mithra, and or to the Roman emperor, or to or different deities, etc. So nothing was absolutely exclusive. And also Jews and Christians also had moments where they went in and became Yahwist for a while, at least in terms of curses and magic formulae. So Yahwism was always there, not in the background, but in the foreground, in terms of and it was an extremely popular. Yahwism was extremely popular also across the empire. Now, this also helps to explain, because the Roman Empire was at a point where in the 4th century, where it was almost, it would have gone either with Mithraism or Christianity.
And let me guess what you're about to say. I have to. This is so exciting, because this is something that I've really been. I went into this evidence kind of blindly, just kind of leading see where it takes me. And I came to the conclusion that this explains the rise of Christianity in a way.
Right. Exactly. This is what made Christianity a lot more palpable to the Romans. And this is why the early church fathers had to combat the remnants of Yahwism all over the empire, right? So that's what they wrote against what we call the Gnostics. In a sense, the Gnostics are simply Yahwists, okay? And so the, or what they call Gnostics, again, this term is so misleading, but all of the different sects, the Sethians, etc., all of these different forms of Yahwism are simply forms of Yahwism.
A lot of them call themselves Magus too. You hear that, Simon Magus, Marcus Magus. So there's some sort of Persian stuff going on here, which is what we're going to get.
Well, the Magus. So Magus. Now we're starting to go back to the Persian context, and I'd like to continue with that. But but Magus, in the Greek sources, there were several major people who were called Magus, and one of them was Moses.
Wow.
So one of them, they considered Moses to be a Magus as well in several Greek sources. Yep.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, they considered Moses was. What's really interesting about Moses, about the figure of Moses, is if we were to go back even further back in time to the 3rd century, and even the early 2nd century BCE, but mainly in the 3rd century, and even late 4th, so late 4th to the early 2nd. And what we wanted to know what people think of Moses, we would get at least 5 completely different stories.
You got Hecates of Abdera, right? Hecates of Abdera is probably the first person.
That's right. Well, that's one of the sources. Absolutely. Moses was seen as this military leader who defeated the Ethiopians, or one that defeated other Nubian tribes, or a Magus, an alchemist. And it has echoes in the Bible, how Moses was an alchemist and was able to do all these to make nature do what he wanted, but also that Moses was the teacher of Orpheus, because he was.
I've been all over that verse because I want people to look, guys. These Alexandrians, these Jews in Alexandria, they're calling themselves Orphics, basically. They're saying. Yep. Musaeus, this guy from Athens, is the same as Moses, and there's all. Tell us about that, and then let's get back to the Persians.
Yeah, I mean that's just typical kind of popular etymology. In Greek, Musaeus sounds like it's the muse, the muses, and so you hear that, and you're like, yeah, that's the teacher of Orpheus. He was also seen, as I said, as a magus, as an alchemist, as someone who can bend the rules of nature according to his will. And so that also shows that the story of Moses and who that was not decided even in the 3rd century BCE. Okay, there was no canonical version. What's interesting in these versions of Moses is that they are not polemic. They're not even debating other versions. They're not trying to show how their version is correct and like the biblical version is wrong. They're simply ignorant. They don't know of the biblical version.
Right. That's another important thing, is like this Moses is completely different than we think of today.
That's right. Well, it's not. That's what's interesting, is it's not completely different. The Bible shows, I think, took all of these images of Moses that were already current in the region, in Ptolemaic, in the Ptolemaic regions, and is the Bible is polemic with those versions. So it takes elements. We do see elements, for example, of Moses doing supernatural things, parting the seas, all of the and tossing the rods, and they become oak. So we do see elements that were popular in the Greek culture being adopted by the biblical authors, but we don't see the other way around. The earlier sources are not arguing; they are simply unfamiliar with the biblical sources.
They present him as sort of like a superhero magus character who's
correct, yeah,
doing a bunch of magic, and he's kind of a hero type, typical of Hellenistic,
absolutely, yeah,
hero character. And it's okay, that is fascinating. You got this Musaeus character in Athens, and then there's Moses down in Alexandria, and they're sort of trying to figure out if it's the same person or not. Orpheus also. And in the James Charlesworth Pseudepigrapha, there's a whole chapter on Orphica text, that are these Jewish Orphica texts, And look at what Orpheus is. He's a psalmist. He's playing music on a harp, and it's theological music. He's called theologian. That's where that word comes from. The first time people ever used the word theologian is for Orpheus. And some of his texts are referred to as apocalypses, revelations. So a lot of the same technical terminology we're seeing for Judeo-Christianity, we're seeing in these Orphics in Alexandria.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting is also, even in the 2nd century, the Exegogue of Ezekiel. If I'm assuming you're familiar with that. That's a play, a Greek play that was written in Alexandria, probably performed in Alexandria, where a Jewish author that is completely Hellenized. I mean, he writes perfect.
Tragedian, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. He's Ezekiel the tragedian, and even his version of Moses in the 2nd century, so relatively late 2nd century BCE, is not exactly the biblical version. It's also kind of a mishmash. He is familiar now with the biblical version, and he is dealing with it, or at least a version that is very close to what we know from the Bible. But even in the 2nd century in Alexandria, 2nd century BCE, that's the story of Moses was still not completely canonized. Was not completely did not reach the form that we are familiar today.
You ready for this? This is a question, and your answer might shock some people with this. Who is the first person that we can say with a name, not just always mentioned in some biblical text, but that we can put a name and a date on? Who's the first person to mention Moses?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell, because we do have some sources that seem to mention Moses, but they are quoted in much later sources. And that we need a huge grain of salt for that. I mean, we do have Hecataeus of Abdera, but only quoted in much later Christian sources that are trying to make a point and are polemical.
Oh, so you're saying that's the one they're citing?
That's right.
Because we lost the Hecataeus of Abdera.
Correct. Yeah, we lost the original. So they're citing him. Now, in many cases, the citations are fine, but we need to take each case independently and evaluate how likely it is to be accurate. In many cases, I have my doubts, but let's be very open here and say, you know what, let's even accept that we're talking about Hecataeus of Abdera, late 4th century. So what's that?
Like 320 BC, something like that.
Right. So even then, even if that is the first time a Moses is mentioned, that's very late.
Very late. That's what I mean by, like, this might shock some people. How often is, because, okay, here's another thing because I've been bouncing these ideas off with biblical scholars who are more on the, not, I wouldn't say conservative side. They're not conservative, but like they're more on like they're going with the, what's the earliest we can date it? We're kind of going at, we're trying to find the exact time where we can date things based on what we know for sure. These scholars that I'm thinking, I'm not going to name names here, but like they're going with like, oh, what about 7th century BC? There's a reference here in one of the prophets. Do the prophets seem to know Moses? I don't think they do.
Well, I'm laughing because I mean, I cannot take the Bible as an historical source. Okay, I have to say that very clearly. No one should. Now, the Bible does have, of course, let's how to phrase that, does have historical elements in it, but it's not a historical source. Now, like for example, there are certain Assyrian kings that are mentioned in the Bible and are mentioned within the context that makes sense. But the Bible is not interested in them as a historical source. It's interested in them. It's interested for different reasons, and it's very, very easy to take a kind of a nucleus, a seed of historical fact, and make a story out of it. We do it to this day, and so we need to be very, very careful with the Bible in terms of historical, and to say what the prophets knew. That statements the prophets knew of, or Hosea knew of X. Hosea knew of the Exodus from Egypt, for example. I get that a lot. How do you know that that particular verse really was not edited into the text in the 3rd century or 2nd century BC? You can't know that.
And let me jump in right there, because we know that the version, the condition, I don't know how to say it, condition, or the form that we have our prophets. We know that there is layers that are added layer. We know that there is additions that are changed. We know that there's redactions. But okay, is it possible that there's a layer from Isaiah that dates back to whatever 6th century BC or something like that? Possibly, yes. And I would say yes. I would say fine. Yeah, there probably was a guy named Isaiah. But the form that we have it in today, there's no way you're going to sit there and tell me that this is exactly how it was.
Right. Well, to be very scientific about it, and that's really what I'm trying to do in my research and with my students, and to go and to be as scientific as possible about this. I would not be able to say that, as a historian, I would not even be able to say there was an actual person called Isaiah, because there's simply no scientific proof for that. But I could, but is a text, some pericope, some text that is currently in what we know from Isaiah, from the book of what's called the Book of Isaiah, that was already authored in the 7th century? Sure, why not? I mean, that I would agree with that statement. But I have an article, for example, about the introduction, right? The oracles against the nations in the book of Amos. Okay. Just this only these verses, and I'm not dating the entire book. I'm just dating the oracles, and I'm dating them and I was able to date them to the late 8th and beginning of the 7th century, because I can relate them to Neo-Assyrian sources, and I show that whomever wrote those passages, these verses, knew in great detail idiomatic expressions from Neo-Assyrian inscriptions and things like that. So I can date, and again, I'm not even saying that they were written. I mean, they could be orally transmitted from that period. But whomever came up with these texts and might have transmitted them, from father to son or whatever, orally over the centuries before they were written down. But the seed for these oracles was late 8th, early 7th century BC. Now I'm able to do that because I can show that they take Neo-Assyrian imperial idiomatic expressions and implement them very systematically within the Amos, the introduction to Amos. That's what you have to do. See, that's what you have to do. That's scientific. Exactly. You always need to have a reference outside the Bible in order to date the Bible. You cannot date the Bible from internal data.
Right. You need something relative to base it off of.
Correct. Yeah.
This is where we get into the whole, how do we test people? Because people think I'm biased. I'm trying to attack the Bible. I'm biased. And I'm like, no. I really don't care how old it is or when it's Hellenistic or Persian or what. I just want to know. And like, there's ways we can test this. So, for example, you mentioned that there's a lot of, I was watching your lectures and you talk about this, how there's idioms that we can tell that are either Persian period. Sometimes they use words that are from the Avestan language, which is an Indo-European language. So it's like, what that can't be that can't go beyond. Well, maybe it could, but I'm saying it's not likely that it can go past the Persian period into some sort of archaic period. And then there's even some that are Hellenistic that we're like, whoa, that's got to be written in like 200 BC. So to sort of bring it back to the Persian period, how do you test and determine what is Persian period versus what is not? Even just the temple, like how do we describe things in the temple?
I'll say something that might shock a lot of people, but basically in the Persian period, we have thousands of documents from Yahwistic/Jewish sources. When I combine all of the documents from Egypt, not just Elephantine, mostly in Elephantine, but not just, and Babylonia, the different settlements in Babylonia, El Yehudu and others, and in Judea and Samaria, these provinces, which we have very little texts from Judea and Samaria, but we have coins, we have representations and things like that. So when I look at all of this data, all of it together, there is literally zero evidence for any knowledge and any familiarity with the Bible. throughout the entire period.
Okay, hold on. Let's explain this now. This is a lot. This is a big claim right here. So when you talk about, first of all, if anyone doesn't know what we mean by elephantine, so in 597 BC, I think that's roughly the date when Nebuchadnezzar sacks Israel, Jerusalem, and the north, south. I don't know. Maybe it's the north or the south.
Well, I mean, yeah, there were waves, but we were usually talking about 586.
586. Okay. So what happens as a result, and as you said, there's different dates and different battles that happen and different attacks. But roughly around this period in the 6th century BC, Israel is under attack and they start to flee south to Egypt, almost in a reversal exodus in a weird way. They're leaving.
Except there was no exodus, so yeah.
Right. Except there was no exodus, and my channel's established that many times. But that's a whole nother. We can get into that another time probably, because that's a whole nother can of worms. But we're talking about later. We're talking about, well, actually, that does kind of relate in a way, but we can circle back to that. All right, so we're talking about 6th century BC. There are Judeans. What did you call them? Israelites or Judeans?
Well, I call them Yahwists. Now, I have a number of articles about this. I have an article about the date in which the colony at Elephantine was established, about the migration under the Egyptian king Amasis II. So I have an article that establishes that date from a lot of different perspectives, and I show that all of these different perspectives meet around 540, 550 BC.
Oh, so okay, we're a few decades later then is when they flee.
That's right. But I have another article about Yahwistic identity at the time. And I show that Yahwistic, and on this article, people might even call me conservative, but I just follow the data.
Follow the data.
And so, yeah, I just follow the data. I don't care if you call me minimalist or maximalist or conservative or whatever. I just follow the data. And so I have another article about the Yahwistic identity in the Achaemenid period that just came out a couple of months ago. In that article, I show from archaeological evidence, names, mostly onomastics at the time, that there was, around the time of the sack of Jerusalem, around the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it started earlier. It started at the end of the 7th century. But there was already a shift, a kind of a cultic reform that created a unified Yahwistic identity, not just Judean, okay, but a unified Yahwistic identity that was pretty uniform in Judea, in Samaria, in Babylonia, and later on in Elephantine, and of course other places. And we see it in the names so clearly. Now the names are personal names are really your most kind of intimate identity, right? Usually you inherit it from your father or your grandfather and things like that, or from your mother. And people, it goes from generation to generation. It is your identity, your familial identity. It's a big part of who you are, your personal name, certainly in antiquity. And we see that in Samaria, prior to the end of the 7th century BCE, in Samaria, most of the Yahwistic names had the theophoric element, meaning the deity part. Usually, names in antiquity are composed of a adjective or a verb with a name of a deity. So, for example, Hosea means Yahweh has saved or redeemed, or Yehoshama, Yahweh has heard, and things like that. And you have it for a lot of different deities across the region, not just for Yahweh. And so these are theophoric names, right? Names that have the theos, the deity embedded in this. In Samaria, it was uniform for a long time that the Yahwistic element in these names is Yo, not Yaho or Yah, but Yo. Okay, that was the name. And in the south, in Judea, it was Yah or Yaho. There was a very clear distinction in how you write the name or pronounce the name in the names of the divine name within the personal names of people. That stopped. That shifted. I mean, the data is so clear. The names shift very clearly to the Judean form. Okay, to Yah or Yahu, towards the end of the 7th century and into the 6th century. But after the fall of Jerusalem, it becomes uniform, completely uniform, whether you're in Samaria, whether you're in Judea, in Egypt, or in Babylonia. It's all Yahu everywhere. This is clearly a cultic reform that was very powerful. I mean, when you give up your name, okay, if you're from Samaria and all of your genealogy is all names, and now you change it to Yahoo. And in fact, we found an example in the archaeological record of the same person switching their name from Yo to Yahoo. And so I mentioned that in the article. And so that was a major cultic reform among Yahwists in the end of the 7th century and into the 6th century BCE. Now, this is just a name reform. We don't see any other. It's not like they had new observances or new laws that they had to follow. We don't see anything like that at that time period. But somehow there was this idea that we need to form one community across, and this is probably the result of these waves of exile that started from the end of the 8th century through a little bit to the 7th century and into the 6th century. All of these waves of exiles and communities living in different places start wanting to have a more unified identity. And yeah.
And so they're going from what we would call Canaan, Judea, Israel, modern day Israel, whatever, Palestine, that region. They're leaving that region because they're being sacked by these Assyrians. And there's waves of them moving south into Egypt, and they're settling in this city called Elephantine, way down south.
It's an island.
Island, yes. And they're way far away now. And they set up in this island there. And then so what I'm gathered from what you're saying, what other people are saying, is like we have a lot of evidence of we have tons of papyri, and we have ostraca. We have a ton of evidence, and we can look at what these people believed in and what their culture was like to a certain extent. And so this is where things get kind of crazy, because the narrative is that these Israelites already had this sort of religion. This is we're at the end of the first temple period, so they already know about Solomon and David and Moses and Noah and Abraham. And that's, of course, they already know about that stuff. And they probably already read Isaiah. They probably already know some, right? This is what everyone assumes. But then, so you're thinking these Jews that came down from, or Yahwists that come down from this region into Elephantine, we're assuming that we're going to find stuff about Moses, stuff about Abraham, stuff about Noah, because that's predating the first temple period. Of course they know this stuff. But what really do we find there?
Right. So of course none of this predates the Persian period or even the Hellenistic period, I would say. I mean, I wouldn't say none of this, but I'm sure that the editors and the redactors and even the authors of many parts of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, used older material as well. So some strands of older material is there, certainly, and even going back centuries. I wouldn't go back as far as the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, but some of the material is certainly older, much older than the Hellenistic period, where these things, according to my research, have been put together. But in Elephantine, it's fascinating what the community at Elephantine, as I said, not just Elephantine, everywhere. I mean, as I said, we have thousands of documents. If we combine everything from Egypt, again, not just Elephantine and Babylonia and the provinces of Judea and Samaria, if we combine all of this together and look for the smallest hint of familiarity with the Bible, there is none. There's simply none. The Bible simply did not exist.
So how many texts do we have, first of all? How big is the sample size of text that we have there? Can we give some estimation? Is there 1,000 texts? Is there 100? Is there 500? What do we?
When I say texts, I mean I'm combining ostraca and papyri together with tablets in the El Yehuda, and that we're talking about hundreds of tablets, several hundreds in the Elephantine and Egypt in general. And of course, all of the numismatic, meaning coins that are also very important, different shards, different names, things like that. Even the Wadi Dalia documents, which were found in Samaria in the late 4th century or middle 4th century BCE, those are really interesting because those papyri that again found in Samaria, written by Sumerian Jews, Sumerian Yahwists, are contracts in which Yahwists are selling Yahwist slaves who are also Yahwists to other Yahwists. When this, of course, goes against what's written in the Torah, but they are clearly doing something that is completely against the. We have a lot of examples of things that are completely against the Torah, and you can excuse every one of these single examples, say, and start to explain, well, maybe profit was more important for them than adherence to the laws. You can excuse every single, but when you look at the totality of the data, okay, it is absolutely. There's only data that of stuff that either is completely ignorant of the Bible or completely goes against it, of what is said. But there's not one single a piece of evidence we can point to that says these people were familiar with the Bible. Nothing. I mean, look, people often ask me, well, what kind of documents do you have at Elephantine or in other places? Most of the documents are legal documents, contracts and things like that. But we do have personal letters. We have ostraka. Ostrakas are like basically the WhatsApp of the ancient world, right? These are short messages that you give that you give to someone in the market to pass on to someone else, and so these are kind of the quick communication methods in the ancient world, and so we have kind of the equivalent of WhatsApp messages. We have personal letters, we have contracts, we have formal letters written to. We have a lot of data.
How much time does it span? So you said in the 5th, or is it 6th century BC?
Yeah, about 540, 550 BCE to 399 BCE. That's Elephantine.
We're talking 2 centuries worth of data.
A century and a half of data. And according, my research points to the really good possibility that after that they migrated up the river, up the Nile to Edfu, where we have later on in the 4th century, we have a very interesting community of Yahwists as well, right there, and several concepts that will make it into quote unquote Gnosticism are already found in Elephantine. Especially if your channel probably knows a lot about dedicated to I don't know dedicated, but a lot deals with Gnosticism. That the deity Chnubis. Chnubis, very popular deity especially in Egypt. It comes from Chnum, the deity Chnum, that is the main deity of Elephantine.
Yeah, he's that horned ram head.
That's right, the ram deity from Elephantine, and he is the really kind of the one who dwells in Elephantine. The first time the form of the name Chnum changes to Chnubis, the first time we have it recorded, is in Elephantine among the Yahwists there, when they write to the Persian authorities about the attacks on their temple on the island. So first of all, they had the temple. I need to tell that to the viewers. Of course, the Yahwists had a Yahwistic temple on the island that was very similar in size to the description that we have in the Bible for the Solomonic temple. And so it was a major, it was relatively major. Very little has remained to this day, but we do have some of it has remained to this day. We do know where the temple was, and we can see, if you visit the island, which I highly recommend. You can see the kind of the pavement of the temple in one wall, or kind of an angle. In any event, that when they talk, they always throughout their they often referred, not often, but they sometimes refer to Chnum in the records from the early 5th century on. They refer to the deity Chnum, but only when they talk about how the priests of Chnum attacked their temple, then they say Chnub. Okay, so they moved to this term hnubis that will become so popular, as you know, in so-called Gnostic circles. But the first time it is recorded is actually among the Yahwists at Elephantine as a pejorative almost term, because it only when his priests attack them. So that's a fascinating thing that needs to be studied further, of course. But you see elements like that. You see Anat Yahu. So Anat, the date, the goddess Anat Yahu, which is a kind of a dyad of the two of Anat and Yahu. That in one of my articles about the Tradição Judaica in the Achaemenid period, I also I show that this deity had a very long life. And we see that deity as Anat Yahu also used in amulets and medallions and so-called Gnostic medallions. So a lot of these things that are recorded for the first time in the community at Elephantine find their way into Yahwistic circles or so-called Gnostic circles that are recorded centuries later. So somehow they were transmitted over the centuries and over the generations. On and are recorded later on. So this community at Elephantine is extremely important, not just for the study of Yahwism / Judaism, but also for the study of Gnosticism, and again with all the problems that I have with that term, and so it is a massively important community. Now, as I said, my research shows that they arrived around in the mid 6th century BCE. They probably arrived first at Aswan, which is the city facing the island of Elephantine. Now, Elephantine, it's important to understand, Elephantine was a major Egyptian cultic site for thousands of years before the Yahwists came.
Okay? Herodotus writes about it too.
Herodotus was there when they were there. Okay?
Right.
So, and he doesn't mention them, but he was.
He says there's 12 gnomes. I think he kind of says. So there is something like, I don't know if that lines up or not, or it's just a coincidence, but he does say something like that. But you're right. He doesn't say anything about Jews or Yahweh or anything like that.
No, I mean, for him, because he probably saw them as Persians. I mean, for him, they represented the empire. But Herodotus was there, and certainly recorded that. But my claim is that, and this is what archaeology shows us for the island, is that they first came to Aswan. Aswan is maybe 100 meters, 200 meters away from the island. I mean, it's really close. And so they came to Aswan, settled there for a while, built a temple on the island. That's another mystery we don't really understand. The only cultic system, the only people that were allowed to build a temple on Elephantine. Again, Elephantine was, as I said, a major cultic center in Egyptian theology for thousands of years before the Jews came, before the Yahwists came. And so, I mean, it was believed. I mean, it was, the reason it was so important is this is the first cataract of the island. Okay, so if you navigate down the Nile, that's where the waters start being unstable. It's a cataract. And you can't really navigate the waters anymore. So in Egyptian world conception, the waters of the annual inundation of the Nile came from Elephantine. Okay, so they had an idea that there's a well and there are two caves under the island from which the waters flow into the Nile and in fact into the entire globe, and that's the source of waters for the entire world. It's
sort of
funny
like a border of the empire in a way.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the border of the empire shifted constantly, but this was, in terms of the waters, this was the source of the waters for the entire. Because it was the first cataract, it was such a big deal. It is still the first cataract, of course, and it was such a big deal for them. That was the source of the waters flowing into the Nile, and then from the Nile into the Mediterranean, of course, and into the entire world. It's funny because I was in Elephantine last June. And I was sitting there with some of the old, the elders of the island, just a fat, great lunch, and just talking, and they started telling me. Of course, they knew nothing about me and my research, but they started telling me about the well that they have there and how this is the source of the water for the entire world. And I felt like Herodotus. You feel like, I mean, that's exactly what Herodotus heard in his day. I mean, he heard the elders of the island saying exactly the same legend to him as if it was, that's what they believe, and that's fine. I respect that, but still, that for me, I was really moved by this, because you hear firsthand the same story that Herodotus wrote down, 2,500 years ago. It's a pretty amazing experience. Anyway, so this island was a major cultic center because of the annual inundation of the Nile, and therefore, the cult of Khnum, of the deity Khnum, was so important there, and it literally affected the economy of the entire land of Egypt. The fact that they allowed the Yahwists to build a temple that was literally adjacent to the temple of Khnum is something that we can't really explain sufficiently yet. But there must have been some kind of another term that I'm not a fan of, syncretism, some kind of connection that the Egyptians also accepted between Yahoo and Khnum, and which is why they would allow that. But again, this is speculation. We don't really have a convincing explanation for this. And then they continue to live on the island up to
Well, that god Khnum is sort of a demiurgic god. He's depicted as holding the potter's wheel. He creates humans. He's very,
which is a theme that you also find in the Bible, right? Also, not just that, but he also creates man from the earth, right? From the earth, and one of his daughter, Anukis, puts Anuket in Egyptian, puts the ankh into the nose of the people that are. So that's also very similar to the story in Genesis, of course, that to moving life into the. And so, we see a lot of that happening there as well.
yeah, wow, that's so fascinating. No, all right, so we established who these people are and how important this was. Now, this is something that I want to highlight because, as I mentioned, you would expect, if we're looking at the timeline of what we're told, the tradition says, Noah and Abraham and all this and David, they all predate this, so of course they have to know. There has to be some knowledge of them in these texts, right? But we don't. We find no Abraham, we find no Noah, we find no Joseph or Jacob.
No, not just in Elephantine. We find no in the onomasticon, meaning in the list of names for that period in anywhere. None of the biblical names from the Pentateuch. I mean, we have names like Nathan, for example, or Hosea and things like that. We have names like that at Elephantine, but that does not show any knowledge of the Bible. These are just names that were common at that time, and continued being common later on, and even today. But names that are clearly biblical, like the names of the 12 tribes, for example, or the names of Aaron and Moses, or the names of the patriarchs. None of these appear in the onomasticon until the early Hellenistic period. Early Hellenistic period. Yeah,
that is fascinating. Okay, I don't even know where to. Okay, so.
Well, I mean, I'll take it. I'll take it even further. That's relatively easy. Okay, the Pentateuch and all that. But according to normal biblical chronology, Nehemiah came to Jerusalem in the mid-5th century
with Ezra and Zerubbabel, right? That's the story.
Well, people are debating who came first, Nehemiah or Ezra, etc., and Zerubbabel, all of that. But I'm talking specifically about Nehemiah coming to Jerusalem in the mid-5th century, and then becoming governor, and ruling there for a while, going back to Babylon for a while, and then going back. All of these decades, pass, and then going back to Jerusalem. In 407 BCE, okay, so about 40 years after supposedly Nehemiah came to Jerusalem, the we have two drafts of a letter that was sent to Jerusalem by the people of Elephantine. Okay, and they sent it to the governor of Judea and to the high priest in Jerusalem. And so this governor in Judea was either the immediate successor of Nehemiah, if we suppose that Nehemiah was a historical figure and that the biblical chronology is correct, then this governor that they're writing to is either the immediate successor of Nehemiah or maybe, the successor of the immediate successor, because we don't know how long the successor, we don't know exactly what the list of governor was, but Nehemiah was clearly still in living memory in 407 BCE, if the accepted biblical chronology is to be trusted. Now, what are they asking for in 407 BCE at Elephantine? They are asking the Persian authorities, or the representative of the Persian authorities in Jerusalem, to help them or to authorize the rebuilding of the temple that was destroyed at Elephantine, to authorize to them the same thing that basically they authorized Nehemiah to do, right? The people of Elephantine are asking the same thing that, according to the Bible, was allowed to Nehemiah, but they don't mention Nehemiah. See what I'm saying? They don't. It's as if they don't know. They're talking about their temple. They explain it in great detail how it was destroyed, in really great detail. Very similar in a sense, although without any knowledge of the description at the end of the second book of Kings, of the destruction of the so-called Second Temple in Jerusalem, and they get into a lot of detail. They talk about how their own temple was built before the Persian conquest, and it was left intact even under the Persian conquest. So they have no problem going into the past to provide precedence to their case. They have no problem giving a lot of detail, but they don't mention an almost identical case to their own that was supposedly happened only a couple of decades or few decades earlier, right? Now, if you are making your case to the Persian authorities and asking them to help rebuild your temple, you would either say, I want you to do to us as you did with Nehemiah, as you did with Jerusalem, I'm asking that you do with us. That would really help your case. Or if we want to just be devil's advocate here, you would let's assume that in actual historical reality, the whole story with Nehemiah didn't work well, and they simply didn't want to remind the Persian authorities of some problems that they had with the rebuilding of the temple. You at least would need to explain why you would be different, but you can't ignore it, right? So the fact that they simply don't mention it, I think, is significant, and it shows that there is a very high probability that Nehemiah either did not exist in history or should be dated to the 4th century rather than the 5th century. The implications from Elephantine are not just with regards to the Pentateuch or Moses and things like that, but also with regards to texts that are dated to the 5th century, Ezra, Nehemiah, and etc.
I get told by scholars all the time that be careful using Elephantine to draw a holistic conclusion on the period, because they're just some fringe people over there. What would you say to something like that?
Well, we should be careful always with the data, and certainly that. So that's a very valid point, very important point that I repeat constantly. The prism of Elephantine is not everything. It's certainly not everything, and that's why I always look at other places. So I compare Elephantine to other places in Egypt, or to, if possible, or to other locations in the provinces of Judea or Samaria or in Babylonia, and very often you will find a lot of symmetry. So I look at all of the data that I can, and I only reach decisions when I do that. I don't only rely on Elephantine. So that's a very valid point. So it's true. We shouldn't, but at the same time, there is no counterexample.
That's what I'm saying. Like, what else do? You kind of, how else do you test the
I
data?
mean, the Bible is simply not a reliable historical source. We need to understand this. The Bible, often people ask me also, well, you accept Herodotus, and why wouldn't you accept the Bible? What's the difference? Now, it's true. First of all, I have to say I don't accept Herodotus, blind. Yeah, I we always examine it with exactly the same kind of skepticism that we do with the Bible. Always.
But let me say something on Herodotus. People are citing Herodotus right away. Or even like, so for example, Homer's Iliad. We have Nestor's cup, and it quotes Homer on the cup, and it's dated to 750 BC. So we're like, all right, we can put Homer in that time period at least to some degree. Maybe not the form that we have it in. But you don't find, there's not like a Moses cup where it cites the words of
nothing. There's nothing from the Bible at all. Nothing from the Bible. Now, they have no problem citing other things. And they had, for example, the Wisdom of Achikar, which was a very famous book. And they did have that. We did find that at Elephantine. They had a copy or a version of the Bisotun or Beistun inscription in Aramaic. So they had literary texts. They had no problem with that. They just didn't have the Bible or any quotes of the Bible. They didn't use idiomatic expressions from the Bible. They are being persecuted. So that's really important. From around around 415-ish BCE to when their temple was destroyed in 410 BCE. But they were persecuted again, not for cultic reasons. They're for political reasons. But they were persecuted for a while, for several years, and then their temple is destroyed. They write to the governor and the high priest in Jerusalem, by the way, and in Samaria. So both in Jerusalem, in Judea, and in Samaria, and the high priest. They write to them, to their co-religionists, without any mention. I mean, these are Jews persecuted in Egypt, writing to their co-religionists in Judea, not a word about the Exodus, about Moses, again, you would. That's pretty. Again, every story, every element like that, every data point like that can be explained away. You can say, well, maybe they didn't want to go into. You can explain everyone independently and excuse it all, but the overall picture is there is not a single counterexample.
Right.
So again, you can excuse all of these, everything that I'm saying, and say, well, maybe they didn't want to do this, maybe they knew about it, but they ignored it. You can explain that, but give me one counter example. There is none.
And this is such a good point. But let's try to explain what are they worshiping? Are they just worshiping Yahoo, or is there other gods?
Other gods, definitely. Yeah, other gods.
Can we tell us about what they're straight up polytheistic? There's no question about that, right?
Again, another term that I'm not comfortable with, as you know.
The terms polytheistic and monotheistic, they're I agree with you. But just for people who understand these terms,
right? They are not. There is no monotheism in the ancient world. Strict monotheism in the ancient world at all. It wasn't even a concern. It wasn't. And strict monotheism, by the way, is an Islamic innovation. Really, the tawhid, this uniqueness of God, and absolute monotheism, is an Islamic innovation. But what they had at Elephantine, so their main ethnic deity, the deity that you find in many of, not all, of their personal names, is Yahweh. And the temple that they built, and they certainly invested a lot of resources into building, is the temple for Yahweh. And they also claim that Yahweh dwells in Elephantine. Literally, he dwells at Elephantine.
You don't hear that. I've never heard that before. That's something.
Yeah, but they literally say that. And so they don't say he doesn't dwell in Jerusalem or in Mount Gerizim or in other places, but they say he does dwell there at Elephantine. Now, and so again, the temple is the temple was, with cedar wood ceilings and bronze doors and stone. It was a very sumptuous temple. And so that their main deity, certainly the main ethnic deity, was Yahweh. But they also make oaths, take oaths in the names of other deities. They also say that that Knum is against them, is attacking them because of something that happened.
He's like us Satan, one Satan.
Right. And so, and also, very interesting, really in the last year or two of their time on the island, we have a fascinating document, again, in this article that I have on Tradição Judaica. In the Achaemenid period, I go into detail on this. There's a fascinating papyrus, long papyrus, of contributions that the Yahwists on Elephantine make. 2 shekels, 2 shekels, 2 shekels. They are making contributions. It begins with these. This is the contribution for Yahoo. And at the end, after all the accounting is done of all of the contributions, you have a list of the monies that were, I'm just translating in my head, but the monies that were collected on this day to Yahweh, Anat Bet El, and Eshem Bet El. So there's a triad. They begin the document with saying this is for Yahoo, but at the end they say this amount of money goes to Eshem Bet El, this amount of money goes to Yahoo, this amount of money goes to Anat Bet El. And Eshem Bet El and Yahoo get almost exactly the same amount. I mean, very, very small difference between the two. Yahoo gets a little bit more. But Eshem Bet El, and there's a discussion whether it's a feminine deity or a masculine deity. Anat Bet El is clearly a feminine deity. But it is a triad, a Yahwistic triad. And interestingly, 2 of those deities are really dyads, because Eshem Bet El is Eshem and Bet El, and Anat Bet El is Anat and Bet El. So you have 3 or 5 different deities that are receiving significant contributions from the Yahwists. These are all people, or mostly people with Yahwistic names. By the way, there were Yahwists that had Egyptian names. Okay, and so we have, or even Persian names. So we have the name. If the name is Yahwistic, it clearly shows that the person was most probably a Yahwist. But we also have clearly Yahwists who are who take on Egyptian names. We have people with Egyptian names who give their sons and daughters Yahwistic names. We have a Yahwist who gives his son a Beth El name rather than Yahweh. So they had, now around 420 BCE, there was some kind of reform on the island, very clear reform that changed. I mean, this community has one form before 420 BCE and another form after 420 BCE. And so there was clearly a reform. I won't get into that because that would probably add another hour to this discussion, but there was clearly a reform and that reform got them a lot closer to the Persian / Achaemenid Zoroastrian, or really early Zoroastrian format. Really interesting. That is, again, one of my article on the Tradição Judaica goes in a lot of detail on that, is that they say when they talk about the destruction of their temple, one of the documents, they have several documents describing it, but one of the documents talks about it says that they brought an offering to Yahweh. I mean, it's very fragmentary, and the line under that says that one atrodan, that they had an atrodan there. Now, atrodan is in today in Zoroastrianism is an atashdan, in just a different format, but that is the fire holder of Zoroastrian cult. So in their temple, in the Yahwistic temple, they had a fire holder.
Is that an Avestan term that you just used?
Yeah, it's an Avestan term.
That's not a Semitic thing. That's an Avestan thing.
Absolutely. Wow. Now, I've had people say, and this is in my article that is in the book that we're talking about. My paper in that book goes into a lot of detail on this, and some people say, well, it's a fire holder. A lot of people translate it as a fire altar. I don't use the term fire altar because it is not an altar. It is a holder of. There's nothing sacrificed or offered on it. The Zoroastrians don't offer anything on this.
Yeah, so but this is exactly what the Zoroastrians are using to not worship. They're not worshiping the fire, but they're using
venerate the fire. That's correct. That is the center of the Yasna, the Zoroastrian cult. So they had this, and they use I mean, if they wanted to just simply say we have something that holds fire, not necessarily Zoroastrian, but something that holds fire in the temple, they could have used the Aramaic Duda de Nura or something like that in Aramaic.
But they use the Avestan terminology.
Use the technical cultic term, the Avestan term, in that to describe what they have. So the level of assimilation is very. I mean, when you have in your own temple a Zoroastrian fire holder and you are using that term, that cultic term, you know what you're doing when you're using this technical term. Again, if they just wanted to say we have something that holds fire, it's very easy to say it in Aramaic, right? It's really easy. And in fact, in the Talmud, where they lived in Sasanian times and they live among Zoroastrians, they had no problem talking about the fire temple, Bidinura or Binura. So they have no problem using pure Aramaic to describe what it is without using Avestan terms.
And in Aramaic is the imperial.
So it's Avestan / Persian. It's not purely. I mean, the Atar of Dan is in Avestan or really Iranian terms. But in any case, it's a Indo-Iranian term that is very, of course, also very frequent in the Avesta.
Wow, imperial Aramaic is that the imperial tongue of the Persians, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It's the imperial tongue. I mean, it's the lingua franca of the day. It's not a Persian language. But Persians and Aramaic have a very long story, history together. Even, Middle Persian, of course, takes a lot of the
and then that kind of explains why Cyrus the Great is considered to be the Messiah in some of these later texts that come in the Hellenistic or Persian period, maybe. Right? Is that what you would date Isaiah to, a Persian period text? What would you say about that? Or who knows, right?
It's really who knows. I mean, the Cyrus's renown and all. I mean, you know that Alexander the Great revered Cyrus.
Yes.
And so the fact that someone makes a big deal out of Cyrus does not help date this. I mean, you can have Cyrus as a big name centuries later. So that doesn't really help. The question here I would ask as a historian is who has the interest in introducing Cyrus as a Messiah? Why? What was the reason to do that?
That makes sense for a Persian period thing, though, right?
No, not just. I mean, Cyrus was very popular also in Hellenistic times. So
yeah, it's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
I don't want to focus too much on that part. I wanted to ask you, and I don't want to get too far off. I wanted to ask you, is this just in Elephantine's Yahoo temple where they're using the fire, or is this also in Samaria?
Well, excellent question. We don't know. I mean, we know there's only one mention of this fire holder at Elephantine. Fascinating. The context is really clear. It's the temple. It's also in the context of offerings and things like that. It's a fascinating but it's very fragmentary. But it does appear very clearly in that fragment. But we don't have. It's purely speculative. But I do think that 420 BCE was a watershed moment in the relationship between the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and the Yahwists all across the empire. Now, when I started looking into that, I said, well, we see it very clearly at Elephantine. We really see after post 420, which is Darius II. So post 420, we see a major shift and a lot more assimilation with Persian ideals, Persian ideas, and even going to a really extreme measure, extreme in our eyes, but a very significant measure of having a fire holder within the temple to Yahweh at Elephantine. So that must have been, because it's a relationship with the Yahwists and the empire, that must have been true of all Yahwists everywhere. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, the temple complex on Mount Gerizim, which was also Yahwistic, of course, was constructed around that time. Depending on who you talk to, some people date it.
So the likelihood of it, if it's built around the same time, the likelihood of it having the similar features is a lot higher, right?
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about the architecture because the architecture was certainly different. But what I'm saying is that there is an investment because building a temple like this requires imperial, of course, authorization and investment. And so the empire not only so at that around that time of the 420 reform, 420 BC reform that is documented very clearly at Elephantine, we see that the temple on Mount Gerizim is being sponsored, so to speak, by the Achaemenid Empire, and a lot of scholars, and I agree with that, claim that the temple in Jerusalem was also built at that time. This is why throughout our talk today, I said so-called Second Temple, because these terms are very misleading. The first temple is simply the first temple that the Bible acknowledges or the Bible talks about. Clearly, I mean, we know that Jerusalem was an important city also in the Elamarna period. There was certainly some temple there, although not Yahwistic. And certainly there continued to be temples there even after the Bronze Age collapse and then later on. Because there is no city without a temple in the ancient world. Simply, there must have been a temple. You can't, even if it's under even if it's under the sky, but there's some sacred space within the city. Okay, so in the ancient world, it's completely inconceivable to have a city without some kind of temple. A city would simply be not protected if it didn't have a deity protecting it. So the concept of a city without a temple is impossible. So there was some kind of temple. So the whole concept of a first temple is not historical. The concept of a first temple. There was a temple. Whether there was a Solomonic, whether it was a historical Solomon is another question. Whether this one is a whether he actually constructed the temple is yet another. But let's say there's this. We call that the first temple. Then what is the second temple? When was another sacred area built in or accepted in Jerusalem? The normal chronology says 516 BCE, according to the chronology that's suggested in the Bible. But that date is simply there in order to provide a 70-year gap between 586 and 516.
They need that to happen.
They need that to happen. Yeah, exactly. So you need to have the 70 years because that's prophecy, and so that is not established. That's not a historical. If I'm looking at it again scientifically, I cannot take that as a historical fact. And then clearly there was something that was built with someone at the time, a Nehemiah or someone like that somewhere in the 5th century. And we know from archaeology that on Mount Gerizim, which was as Yahwistic as Jerusalem was, there was no difference in terms of authority between. And we also find Judeans making offerings on Mount Gerizim. So Mount Gerizim was a completely legitimate temple for Yahwist at the time, not less so than Jerusalem. And there was also definitely a Yahwistic temple also in the town of Samaria as well. We talk about this in the book that that we're actually talking about, supposed to be talking about here. There's also articles that refer to Samaria and the cultic context in Samaria at the time as well in the Achaemenid period. So we're talking about a very complex picture at the time, and we start seeing towards the end of the 5th century BC. Again, there are people who date the construction of the Mount Gerizim temple to the mid 5th century, based mostly on coins and things like that were found. Coins are not enough to date because you can have a coin that comes from an earlier period. Simply, there's no reason to switch to a new type of coin so long as the weight of the coin doesn't change. So people used coins for a long period of time, even after they were issued. So these are not good reasons, but I think there are much better reasons to date it to the last quarter of the 5th century, and that fits, this Persian support for the Yahwists, and probably the temple in Jerusalem was built at the same time, as part of this same policy towards the Yahwists around the same time. Now then you have Herod's temple. right? Is that the third temple? If you're talking about the second temple, is that the third?
I've always asked that. I've always said that too. How do you, and that's funded by Augustus.
Yeah. So this terminology of second temple, first temple, this is completely, it's not a scientific, it's not a scientific terminology.
Yeah. Now, when I first encountered you on the internet, it was actually, I'll just say what happened to tell the story real quick. Dan McClellan retweeted a post about the Elephantine community was just like the Israelites. They had a Passover and everything. And I saw this and I just thought to myself, this is so misleading. And I went in there keyboard warrior style. Wait a minute, they don't even mention Abraham. There's no Moses, there's no Noah, there's no Jacob. I was like, what are you talking about? And I didn't even know that there was a Passover. And then they were like, oh, here's where it says Passover. And they're talking about the letter from 419 from people saying that Darius is allowing us to have a Passover. And then you came in and said, wait a minute, not so fast. It's not the Passover you think. The Pesach is being used in a different. So explain what you meant by this Passover letter is not what people think.
Right. Well, that's a huge topic. I'll try to make it short. So the term Pascha, or the Pesach in Aramaic, is mentioned early in the 5th century. So if we're talking about this 420 BCE document that's erroneously called the Passover letter, that's much later, right? But the term Pascha, this term that is a cognate term to the Hebrew Pesach, appears already early in the 5th century BC in Elephantine. Now, but the problem is that the contexts are not remotely related to what we know of the biblical Pesach. So, first of all, it appears only in 2/2.5 ostraka in all of the Elephantine record.
By the way, real quick, this is all the way at the end of the period too. We're talking 419, but they've already been there for 100 some years.
Yeah, but also the term Pesach has been there already from the beginning of the 5th century. It's something else, and in these 2.5 ostraka, the reason I'm saying half is that there is another ostrakon that I refer to in a different article that has a word that combines Pesach with another word. That's a different story. But let's focus on these two ostraka that mention Pesach. Clearly, I mean, there is another ostraka where people suggest that it might, because it has a paid people complete this as Pesach. I don't because it's too speculative. I don't really deal with that. But there are two ostraka where it clearly uses the term Pascha. The first one is a very short ostrakon. I mean, the first one is very short. The second one is actually a very long ostrakon, relatively speaking. But the first ostrakon talks about about a family, about children being in some kind of danger, and the person writing the ostrakon says, keep a close eye on the children. Don't leave them out. Let them out of your sight until their mother comes. Knead the bread until the mother comes. And send me news of the children. Always inform me. So there's a lot of anxiety in that ostrakon. Clearly, the children are in some kind of danger. Maybe there's some kind of epidemic at the time or whatever. There's a lot of anxiety. And then at the end, he says, tell me when you are doing the Pascha. Let me know. Now, the biblical Pascha is one event for which you can never ask when is it going to happen, because it's always in the night of the 14th of Nisan, and it's always in sunset, between the evenings, as it is mentioned, right? So the time between the sun starts to set and the time when it's completely set. So when the fact that they ask, tell me when you're going to do the Pesach, means that it's not set, it's not fixed.
I didn't think about that. That was a good point. And by the way, real quick, they already have to my knowledge, I did some research in this for a video I was working on, and there already are tons of festivals throughout times in the Assyrian period, the Persian period, that celebrate some sort of agricultural rebirth of the sun, New Year festival at this time, and it's usually right around the Nisan 14 date.
Correct, absolutely. No, the Nisan 14th. So just to finish with the ostraka are not related to any specific date. So it's not Nisan 14th or anything like that. They're simply not. It was a completely movable ritual, and it was probably an apotropaic ritual, meaning something that basically, how to fight evil, how to form of exorcism, if you will, or a apotropaic ritual. And we have actually an echo of that even in the Bible. In Exodus chapter 12, it says that the quote unquote original Pesach was when you put the blood on the entrance to the building, to the house, to make sure that the evil does not come in. That is probably the biblical echo of how this Pesach was actually performed. It was basically a ritual that was performed whenever you wanted to make sure that evil does not enter your home. Okay? And so, again, it's even echoed in the Bible, and it was probably the thing that they did in order to save those children that they mentioned in the Ostracon that were under some kind of danger. I have an article that is about to come out on another Ostracon that mentions Pesach, also a very anxious situation. People are very anxious about some people who are coming to Aswan, to the city that is facing Elephantine. Elephantine is mentioned in. I mean, the context is also in Elephantine there, and they mentioned the Pascha. We don't really know; it's too fragmentary. The area that mentions where the word Pascha appears, so we don't know exactly what they mean by that. But it is the same context of high anxiety, something that is, I mean, before the text on this Ostracon prior to the word to where the word Pesach appears is this some kind of letter that they receive, and they send it, and they really need to understand it well, so they send it to some other person to explain it, and then they send it to another person to explain it, and they really need to understand what's going on, because some really important people are going to come to us on that day. And so there's a clear sense of anxiety, and again the word Pesach appears. So my sense is that Pesach, in the beginning of the 5th century, Pascha, has nothing to do with with its biblical, the use of its biblical cognate, but it's simply some ritual that was enacted to combat evil, to make sure that evil does not attack you, does not. So that's, and again, it's echoed in the Bible as well. In Passover is a debatable etymology. But the idea that this is something that you put blood on the entrance to your home to make sure that evil does not come in, that seems to be the actual original ceremony. It was not fixed in time.
And this letter from 419, coming from the Jews under Darius, doesn't say anything about a lamb, or the word.
It doesn't use the term Pesach.
It doesn't even use the word Passover. They call it a Passover letter, but it doesn't even use the word Passover.
It doesn't use the word Passover or matzah or matzot, or unleavened bread.
Oh, it doesn't mention the unleavened bread? I thought it did. Does it?
No, it doesn't.
So they're just assuming that it does.
You're right. I mean, that's just the restoration that was done.
See, this is blowing my mind. So, all right. So to wrap this all up, this is crazy.
Now, let me actually go a little bit more further. And so my chapter in this book that we're talking about goes into is a very detailed epigraphic analysis of this papyrus, so-called Passover letter. Again, very erroneously called the Passover letter, but I'm providing a very detailed epigraphic analysis, line by line, word by word. But also, then I provide the context that I think it really should reflect. Now, what's really interesting is that if we remove all of the proposed reconstructions, I mean, Zachau, the German scholar who published it initially in 1903, the first one to publish this papyrus, he said that he was able to reconstruct this, to understand this papyrus based on Deuteronomy and Exodus. That methodologically is unacceptable to us today. I mean, this is one of the great scholars of the beginning of the 20th century, but today, if someone would tell me I was able to restore this based on Deuteronomy and Exodus, I have a methodological problem with that. You can't do that, right? You have to establish first that there was such a thing as a Passover in the 5th century BC.
Or that there was a Deuteronomy before.
Or there was, exactly.
Because no one ever mentions Deuteronomy ever until.
That's right. That's right. And so, but not only is Passover not mentioned or unleavened bread, but there are no prohibitions on anything at all. Okay, in the reconstructions that certain scholars have done over the years, they restore "do not eat, do not drink," right? But it's only restoration. The actual papyrus, and I did go to Berlin and studied it in person, and took microscopic infrared and multispectral photos of each word independently and studied it and made sure that I'm reading this as scientifically as possible. There is simply nothing is prohibited. There is no "do not eat, do not drink," but drinking is very central to that document. Drinking something, and it says be pure, keep yourselves pure. He does not describe what he means by "be pure," by the way, which is really important. So clearly they understood what he meant. The person writing this extremely important document is called Hanania, and they clearly understood what he meant by being pure. He didn't have to explain to them what that means. And then in the next line after that, he says, "Drink something." He doesn't say "don't drink." He says, "Drink something," and then it continues with the. But so clearly, there was something really important about drinking something on that document. Again, I make all kinds of proposals in my
Maybe the Haoma drink, right? Because the Persian.
That's what okay. So you do know what I'm saying. So yeah, my suggestion is that this was a Haoma drink. The Yazna. So Yazna is the
Real quick, just for anyone who has no idea what that is, what is the Haoma drink? And then I'm not in any rush to finish as long as you're not.
Okay, great. So the Yazna is the large Zoroastrian ritual. Beautiful, impressive, fantastic. I really recommend that people go and check. There's a website called the Multimedia Yazna, where you can actually see it in an interactive video that was created by SOAS University in London. Amazing project, and a lot of information about the Yazna ceremony. Yazna is not a festival. It's kind of like a Catholic Mass or a Orthodox Christian Mass. It happens every day. Okay, every day there's a Yazna, and it also happens for special occasions. Okay, so it's simply the liturgy that happens constantly, and it's several hours long, by the way, in the Zoroastrian liturgy. So that's the Yazna. We know that the Yazna. So with the Passover, as we said, there is simply no records of it extra biblically, but we do have records of the Yazna in the Achaemenid period. Okay, we have pictographic representations in the Achaemenid period in Persepolis and other places, where in several places across the empire, that show clearly that the Yazna was already practiced in the Achaemenid period. So we have on one hand the Passover that is simply not documented anywhere, or this Yazna, which is amply documented in the Achaemenid period. Now, in the pictographic representations of the Yazna in the Achaemenid period, we do have the preparation of the Haoma drink represented on these inscriptions, which is a mortar and a pestle. That's how you press the Haoma. Okay, that's how you make the Haoma drink. That is a major part in the Yazna. Happens twice in the Yazna ceremony. And that's what you make this drink, which is an intoxicating drink. It doesn't make you drunk, but it's
like the kaikion of the Greeks, but it's also like soma for the Indians.
For the Indians, exactly. And it has, in certain places it is replaced by wine, actually, because it's also pressed and also intoxicating. And we see it also in China. There are also later communities in China.
Does it have psychedelic properties? I've heard that before, or do we not know?
We really don't know what exactly was the Haoma at the time. What Zoroastrians or Hindus today use as the soma, it's probably a very different, so we don't really know what it is that they actually used. It's also being debated. But what we do know is that the Yahwistic community at Elephantine assimilated deeply. I mean, we talked about the fire holder, right? Deeply assimilated Zoroastrian elements into their own cultic sphere, right? Now, this document that is erroneously called the Passover letter is much closer in what it describes to the Halma, to the Yasna ceremony, than to of course, to anything that we know from the Passover. Now, the date, the only thing, the main reason that people refer to this as the Passover letter is because it refers to an observance that starts on the 15th of Nisan and goes on for 7 days. Now, the thing is, the 14th of Nisan is simply the 14th and into the night between the 14th and the 15th of Nisan is simply the first full moon of the year. Nisan is the beginning of the year, and it's the first full moon of the year, and it's the sign for the beginning of the harvest. So in the ancient world, the first full moon of the year was a major event. In the ancient world, people need to understand, because in the modern world, we don't understand just how precarious life was. But in the ancient world, you live or die based on the results of the harvest, of just how much you got from the harvest. That keeps you alive for the next year. Now, if towards the end of Nisan and that time period of spring, when the harvest begins, if your deity rains hail or floods or thunderstorm, all of that can literally kill you. Okay, that could destroy families, could destroy villages, and so that period was extremely important. And the first full moon of the year in Nisan was a period of trepidation. You're really concerned. You're worried about the immediate future, and you want to make sure that this harvest is important. So all across the ancient Near East, the 14th of Nisan was a major date.
Let me just so people who might not understand. So 14 days after Nisan 1, which is a lunar calendar, so the first of Nisan would be a new moon. 14 days later would be the first full moon. Is that how we would do it? And so no matter what the situation is, we have a solar calendar. So our calendars sort of just are like automatic every 12 months, and we have 365 days in the year. But they had to tune their calendars to line up with the moon, so that on the first of every month it would be a new moon.
So it's really lunar solar calendar. It's you adjust it with the sun, and it's a lot more complicated. It's a more complex, but that it served its purpose certainly in the ancient world. Calendars in the ancient world is another fascinating topic.
And Nisan was the first month.
The first month of the year, right?
Oh, there we go. So Nisan 14, by the way, that's the day Jesus is crucified on. Nisan 14 happens to be the first full moon of the year. Wow.
It is every year the first full moon of the year, and it is the beginning of the harvest. Okay, and so that is a major, really important day where people really did everything they can to make sure that the deities are not angry with them. Right.
The Assyrians had a big festival. The Assyrians had called the Kisu festival. Huge festival. It was a week long, and they actually did. I have an academic paper who wrote about this in my folder here, and they had 72 gods under Dagon was the head of the pantheon, and they all got dedicated to them a lamb sacrifice. So there is a lamb sacrifice happening in this time by the Assyrians. Now the Persian period, I don't know if they did something different, but let me just ask you this. Do you think it's safe to say that whatever was going on in the Persian period for this festival was being adopted by Elephantines, Samaritans, all these different groups of people?
Well, it simply wasn't a festival yet. It was a one-time observance. This happened in 419 BCE, this particular letter, really at the beginning. So this is 420. I mean, the letter was sent in the first 2 weeks of Nisan, because he says this year you should do this. So the year begins at Nisan first. He's talking about something that should happen on Nisan 15th. So clearly he's writing this somewhere between the 1st and the 15th of the same year.
Brand new observance that they're introducing.
Well, again, it's not necessarily an observance. I think it's really the reason that they wanted to do that, because we already talked that there was some kind of close relationship between that started around 420 BCE between the Achaemenid period, and we talked about the Mount Gerizim, we talked about about the fire holder, we talked about and we see it also in coins from that period. But there was a lot more, a lot of the imperial Achaemenids were started around 420 to be very close to the Yahwists at the time. I think that this particular document is the document where, because in order to be close, to be promoted as a people group, as an ethnic group, to be promoted to being part of the dominant ethnic class, you have to be pure. And in order to be pure, in the Zoroastrian view, in order to be pure, you drink the halma. The halma purifies you cosmically, according to their understanding. It really recreates you, and Herodotus talks about this as well. So I think that this document really describes their kind of a ceremony of becoming an organic part, if you will, of the Achaemenid Empire, rather than anything related to the Passover. But I do think that the Passover, decades later, is based on the Zoroastrian Yasna. And that was the first time it was kind of done and connected to the dates of that festival. But ceremonies where you have a drink made out of pressed natural ingredients that is also intoxicating, and unleavened bread. There are only two rituals that I know of that have that: the Passover and the Zoroastrian Yasna. So the Zoroastrian Yasna also has unleavened bread.
Yeah, I know. I mentioned this in one of my recent videos about. I did a whole video about the spring equinox festivals, Nowruz and Yasna and Kisu and Passover, Easter, and that was one of the things that I ran into in the academic papers, was that the unleavened bread was a big deal for the Persians.
Right, that's right. It is to this day. The Zoroastrians still have it, call it the dron, which just means a portion. The dron, initially in the Avesta, dron is actually an animal sacrifice in the Avesta. But I think that I can also show it from archaeological records in Persepolis. That's a different story. But I think that when the Zoroastrians started having an empire, early Zoroastrianism with the Achaemenid Empire, when you starts having Zoroastrians across the empire, it becomes really just unmanageable to have them offer animal sacrifice everywhere they go, especially if you have an entire military of Zoroastrians that have to travel. It really becomes extremely expensive and heavy to have animals for sacrifice travel with you. And I think that the shift from animal sacrifice and again, this is speculation, but it makes a lot of sense in imperial times to shift from animal sacrifice to an unleavened bread in the Achaemenid period rather than later on. And I think this is also supported in some ways in Persepolis and in pictographic representation of the Yasna, because in the pictographic representations of the Yasna ritual, as I said, you have the pestle and the mortar where you crush the halma and make the drink. You often have the sponsor of the ceremony represented and one of the priests represented there, but you never have it never shows like a head of an animal sacrificed, or some body part of an animal sacrificed, which you do have in representations in other cults. So it never shows that. I mean, it sometimes there are some cases where it does show that, but in most cases, in the main representations that we have, we don't see that. And so I think that was the period of transition from animal sacrifice. Maybe in Persepolis they still did animal sacrifice, but across the empire they didn't. So that was a period that makes a lot of sense for transition into unleavened bread already in the Achaemenid period in Zoroastrianism.
Wow, we just covered so much in this. This is very fascinating. So if I just wanted to run an idea by you, and you can say if this would be accurate or not based on what you've concluded or based on your research. If I was to say, like, what we consider to be Judaism today is actually just kind of an evolution of ideas starting back in the, obviously going back as far as we know, but progressing through the Persian period and then even more so in the Hellenistic period when you start getting Bible. Is that safe to say it's not like the exact traditional account, more of an evolution of ideas progressing?
Well, every cultic system, every religion is progression, constant progression. Um, yeah, and what's really important is to understand is the Jews were never different from other systems, and I mean they were. I had this article. I don't know if you saw about this priestess in Elephantine. That was also published. I mean, National Geographic did a thing about it as well, where I actually found clear evidence of a priestess serving in the Yahweh temple at Elephantine, and fascinating little ostrakhan that I had to hunt down. Anyway, so I mean, normally you would think that there was no priestesses. There were no priestesses in Judaism. It's only male priests. That's the image that you get from most of the biblical text. I mean, if you dig enough, you can see echoes. There were Jewish priestesses not only in Elephantine but also in Egypt in the 2nd century, 1st century BCE, and then in Rome, in Bechar. I mean, there are Jewish priestesses in many actual priestesses in Judaism as well, but you never hear of that in the Bible. Or directly in the Talmud. I mean, there are echoes that you might be able to interpret also there. But many scholars say, well, what was unique about Judaism is that they did not have priestesses. You read that, and many scholars say that. They say everyone did, but the Jews didn't have didn't have priestesses. But they did. You see what I'm saying? If we only look at the biblical image, it gives us a completely distorted image of reality on the ground, because these are. I mean, again, the Bible. I'm not. I want to make sure that people understand. I'm not against the Bible. I'm not coming. It's not. I'm not trying to do. But we need to understand that the Bible. And going back to the point I was making earlier on about Herodotus versus the Bible as a historical source. Certainly very skeptical of a lot of what Herodotus says, but the big difference between Herodotus and the Bible is that no one had his or her identity defined by Herodotus ever. No one say I'm a Herodotian. Okay, no one had to. It was not a defining text. The Bible defines your identity, and so we have different sects, different schools of thought, each one inserting their own ideology into what eventually became the biblical text. The Bible is this huge battleground of ideas, okay? And it's not concerned primarily or even secondarily with history. It's concerned with expressing those ideas, with expressing theological and mythological ideas on how going back to the Exodus that we talked about at the beginning, the idea of a nation, of a group of people, of an ethnos coming from the East was central to Greco-Roman thought, Hellenistic and Greco-Roman thought. If you wanted to represent your people, your ethnic background as something ancient, something respectable, something that has a long history behind it, you would, in the ancient world, you would provide some kind of mythology on how it came from the East. This is true of the Greeks. In some of the Greek nation states represented themselves as being founded by the Phoenicians coming from the East and founding them there, but also Rome. At one of the heights of its power, Augustus commissioned Virgil to create the mythology of how Rome was founded by Aeneas from Troy, who traveled from the east to and this is exactly the same idea with the story of the patriarchs coming from Abraham, and then having each one of his children go back to the east and to bring a bride from the east and reestablish them. So coming from the east, this origin from the east is so Hellenistic as a
You get the Heraclidae coming from the Lydians. They claim descent from Heracles.
That's right.
As you mentioned, Thebes, they're from Cadmus, who's a Phoenician.
Cadmus, exactly, Phoenician. Yep.
Yeah, they're all claiming descent from some sort of demigod.
Yeah, I mean, even the name Cadmus just means east, right? Kedem.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean,
off the alphabet too.
Yeah, exactly. But also, this ties to the Exodus. This ties to the Exodus because the Exodus is taking this idea of going from Egypt and then entering the land from the east, which makes no sense. I mean, they go all around from Moab and and Edom, and they have to go and enter from the east. Again, the same kind of meeting the same place around Shechem, where Abraham entered the land as well. So you see that there are two narratives of how the people came from the east. One from the patriarch, one from the root of the Exodus. All of this is perfectly aligned with Greco-Roman, certainly Hellenistic, ideals. Yeah, and so and we see that. I mean, it is when you know the context, it's so clear as well. I mean, a lot of people ask themselves, well, why did they have to go all the way around? It doesn't make any sense to go all the way around. And well, you want to establish this Eastern, Eastern provenance.
Providence, right? And that's it's actually fascinating when you look at the truth. Sometimes is more fascinating than the tradition. Yeah,
always. Yeah, that's what gets me up in the morning. I mean, really, for me, researching this, it's always about lifting the hood and looking what is the reality on the ground. Now, again, as I started saying, I'm not anti-Bible or anything like that, but the beauty of the Bible, what makes it so beautiful in many parts of it, and a lot of terrible parts as well, but in many parts of it, what gives its power is simply a question of geography. Because, the provinces of Judea and Samaria, between the Bible was kind of written between the two or composed between these two. That's where every military power, every empire had to pass through that region and leave its imprints in that region. And so the Bible is basically a story of humanity, of how humans left their imprint in this one bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And that was what gives this text its power, really, that all of ancient humanities, at least in these continents, in Africa, Asia, and Europe, left an imprint that is discernible in this corpus.
Yeah, and it's almost like you're getting this tapestry of different layers of different time periods. You got the archaic layer that's in there somewhere, and then you have, as you mentioned, the Persian Zoroastrian influences start to trickle into the text, and then you get this later Hellenistic layer of influences, and the pre-Socratics with their monism and dyads and all that stuff. It starts to get pushed into the text, and so you have a tapestry of different centuries of time periods, different influences, and it's being sewn together.
This could only happen to this extent in that region, just for reasons of pure geographic reasons. But all of these different you have the Persian Empire that brought ideas and influences from India as well, and of course from Iran. I mean, the Iranic peoples. And you have the Greeks, and you have the Egyptians. So you have everything converging in that local area, this tiny little area that absorbed from all of them, and that is what eventually produced this corpus. I mean, it's. I mean, what's beautiful about it is the humanity of it, and the just all of these different cultures coming together, leaving an imprint and moving on, and this was absorbed. Now, again, it was absorbed somehow, but it was not. It was completely unknown to most Yahwists, or practically almost all Yahwists, in the up until the Hellenistic period. I mean, imprints were left, but they were not widely known, and that changed. This is another book that I'm also working on. That changed with the museum in Alexandria. I mean, what people need to understand, I mean, Ptolemy the First and Alexander, called the Great, Alexander the Third, they grew up together. I mean, they were childhood friends. They
both were students of Aristotle.
Exactly. And when they founded Alexandria, the idea was to implement Aristotle's ideals. And so the city was well planned with the grid of streets. I mean, a very modern city. The temple had the doors were automatic, opened up automatically because of hydraulic. When you walked on the kind of the platform leading to the temple, the hydraulic pressure would cause the doors to open up. And so this was like Silicon Valley of the ancient world. I mean, this is where if you want to go to the cutting edge technology of the time, you want to go to where things are done, you go to Alexandria. Now, Ptolemy the First created his palace in Alexandria and surrounded it with the temple and the museum. The museum was just the place of the muses, and within the museum you had the famous library of Alexandria, and it was the first real library in the world. People often say, well, there were libraries before the Library of Alexandria, like Ashurbanipal and other, but these were archives. These were not libraries. This is where you would put different texts, administrative texts, but also literary texts. You would put them in an archive to conserve them, or to teach scribes how to learn their profession. But these were archives. These were not libraries. The difference between an archive and a library is that an archive is to conserve or to use as material to teach scribes and things like that, but it is not a place to study texts critically, which is really kind of what Aristotle wanted and his followers wanted to do, and to find where different manuscripts of the text don't disagree with themselves, or where the same manuscript has all kinds of disagreements within its own text, and so starting to critically study text, that is what happened in Alexandria, and we see that also the same methodology also applied in the Bible. Addition, redaction, etc., following the same idea. Now, historically, it is so clear and so conspicuous that up until the library was established late, really till tail end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria. Up until that moment, we see no, as I said several times already today, zero evidence of any type of knowledge of the Bible anywhere in any of the Jewish diaspora, whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Judea, Samaria, etc. No one knows anything. There are no names that are related to the Bible. There are nothing. No one. It's simply not inexistent. This changes at the beginning of the 3rd century so clearly. We start seeing those names appearing in the lists of names, in the onomasticon. We start seeing people like Keteus of Abdera, or whatever text that we have there. We start seeing people at that time, around the time of the museum. People start knowing something about the Bible, referring to the Bible. It is so clear that there was a shift around that time. And as a historian, I look for triggers. What causes change in history, and you need to find the trigger. And the trigger, I mean, this library in Alexandria is such a clear trigger, such a major trigger. And you see it in the archaeological record so clearly. There's nothing before and it starts after. That I think it's really hard to argue with that.
This is what I've been saying for as long as I started to discover some of this information. And then obviously we get the Septuagint translation coming a little bit later, but it doesn't seem like the construction or the creation of Genesis, for example, let's just take Genesis by itself, doesn't seem to have been constructed that much earlier, maybe less than a century before at some point.
Well, even decades.
Yeah, maybe decades. That's what I was going to say, maybe decades.
We talked about Virgil. It took him 10 years to write the Enneads. Okay, it took him 10 years, one person, and the Enneads, in terms of their length, I mean, it's about the same size as the Pentateuch. So it's one person, 10 years to write the equivalent of the Pentateuch. Now, Virgil also used earlier sources. He did not come up with the idea of Aeneas coming from the East. It was already very popular in Rome before him. There were earlier sources, and one person did that in 10 years. There's the Shahnameh, which is much later, of course, but Ferdowsi, who wrote the Shahnameh, which is like the great Iranian epic, beautiful. I highly recommend the viewers to check that out. The Shahnameh is 150. I mean, it's like 1.5 times greater than the entire Bible, including the New Testament. I mean, the Old Testament and New Testament times 1.5. One man wrote that in 30 years. So 30 years of one man is the equivalent of 1.5 the entire biblical corpus. And also he used earlier material as well. Okay, but this was so people can write this if the right trigger exists and there is the right motivation. People can write this corpus very, very quickly. It happened in.
And when I look at Genesis, for example, it seems to be similar in its construction to other theogonies / Genesis stories, creation myths of the time period, where you have a God who is a demiurgic creator, and he makes heaven and earth, Aranos and Gaia, which is what you see in like theogonies. And sort of Pherecydes has a different version of this. Apollodorus has a different version. They're all contemporary.
Plato with the Timaeus.
Timaeus is the one. That's what I was just going to say. What we get in Genesis seems to be more Platonic. Maybe not. I think it's influenced by Platonic. What would you say?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, it's not exactly. Of course, it's not one-to-one. It's not exactly the same. There are some certain elements. I think it's influenced. It's heavily influenced, as is Plato himself, by Persian.
He admits this. He says that exactly. Pythagoras was taught by Zoroaster.
That's right.
They're all borrowing from each other, but it seems to be in this particular period where you start to see all these ideas of a single perfected, not perfect, but like some sort of eternal demiurgic power who's above all the daemons.
Well, I mean, you have that in Egyptian in the Egyptian worldview for millennia before that. So I mean, it's not exactly necessarily new. The question is not. It's so again, as a historian, you look for triggers. You don't see a historical trigger for that necessarily. Then, if you don't see a trigger, what you need to do is start looking at individual, data points within the text to see, are they closer to the Egyptian model or to the Persian model or to whatever. So you need to start analyzing, because there is no trigger. You need to start analyzing the data as per se and seeing what it relates to more. It's really interesting because a lot of the ancient ideas like that have a very, very lengthy time, shelf life. Okay, they were there for some ideas are you find them in Sumerian texts, and they appear also in Hellenistic Babylonia. Okay, and so a lot of these texts, very often scholars in my field, unfortunately, they say, well, this looks like something from that we find in the Neo-Assyrian text, and therefore I will date it to the Neo-Assyrian. That is extremely simplistic. When I do that with Amos, I mentioned that earlier. When I do that with Amos, I show how just the level of detail where he uses idiomatic expressions that would be lost on people in later centuries. But so that's why I can date the text really quickly, but I only really precisely. But I only date. I'm trying to be really, really cautious and really scientific about this when I can see clear parallels that are indisputable between these the different corpora, that where you can actually make that connection. But otherwise, it's really hard to date these texts in any in any really precise form, and we should be extremely cautious with that. It's overly simplistic to say, for example, they mentioned Cyrus, so clearly it was written during the lifetime of Cyrus, for example, or that is simply not scientific.
I had an even worse argument thrown at me about Genesis predating, or this is what I'm not going to name names because I don't want to. This is a friend of mine. He's a good scholar too. But in this particular thing, he really threw me. I was like, what? Well, I'll tell you what he said. I go, can you find anyone that's citing Genesis in the prophets, for example, or any? Because I'm trying to find out when was Genesis written. And I think it's Hellenistic. But I asked him, I said, what, can you find anyone citing Genesis or quoting from Genesis? And I just asked him this question. And he said, yes, Isaiah does. And then he gives me a passage from Isaiah that has one word in common with one word from a sentence in Genesis. They're not even talking about the same thing. One of them was about creation. The other one was about destruction. They're opposites. And I go, wait, so you're saying that this one word in common with this sentence makes him, I go, that's not a citation.
You know what? Let's even if
he said to me, this is not up for debate, and left.
Okay, so that person is clearly not thinking scientifically. But you know what? Even for the sake of discussion, let's say we find in Isaiah or wherever, in Jeremiah, doesn't matter where, an actual reference to the Garden of Eden, whatever, with actual verbatim quotes. What does that mean? Nothing. Strictly nothing. Because it could be edited.
Well, I was going to say, then you have to wonder, is this one coming after the other one now?
Well, not even, but even that is meaningless. I mean, the point is that we know that the biblical text underwent so many, hands editing and redacting it. We know from Qumran that sometimes they change just one word. If your unit is just a single word, and you can't even date, you don't know when that word was written and added to the text. The text, the text of Jeremiah, the text of Joshua was still in flux in the first century CE. Josephus had a different version of Joshua than what we are familiar with. Okay, yeah, and so we have. I mean, that's first century CE. And the text of Joshua is still in flux. Okay, so I mean, knowing how the Bible was constantly, I mean, it was a text, a living text that was people still, still edited and adapted to their own ideologies throughout the first centuries BCE and into the first century CE. It was still a highly debated and very much still a battleground at that time. So knowing this, it is very easy to add references, like we mentioned earlier, to Hosea to the Exodus in Hosea, right? If I want to make, and by the way, the people in Alexandria, the Greeks or the Macedonians in Alexandria, did the same thing to the Greek, to Homer and Hesiod and others. Right? They edited the text, and when they saw contrasts and contradictions between the texts, they made sure that to correct those texts and add and change a word here, change a paragraph there. They did that with the Greek texts, and of course, also the Jewish redactors, editors of the Bible did the same there as well. It was obvious. It was natural to do. The people in Qumran, for example, had no problem writing texts with the same, believing that they have the same authority as the authors of the biblical texts. It's not, or not in Qumran, but at least the writings that were preserved in Qumran. And so the biblical text it was alive. It was something that is a living document that people are still writing. It was not yet fossilized. It was not yet canonized. It was a living document with different sects fighting for their narrative to be more more widely accepted than the others.
Yeah, and this scholar, I had to look up what was said. It was Jeremiah. So I asked him, I go, is there any instances of one of the prophets citing from Genesis or quoting and saying, as Moses says? He says, yes, Jeremiah 4:23. And I look it up. And the Jeremiah 4:23 says, I looked at the earth and it was formless and empty. And at the heavens their light was gone. And I'm like, so where's the citation? And then he was like, this is what he says. He says, it's clearly dependent on Genesis. And I was like, what do you mean clearly? And he's like, are you being serious right now? Like, he got like mad at me. And I was like, I'm just asking, how do you just assume this is borrowing from Genesis? And it's because that word formless is in there. And I just don't think that's a strong connection at all. I just think that's,
well, I mean, again, even if the quote was verbatim,
by the way, which it isn't.
It isn't. I know it's not, but I'm saying, even if, to give the benefit of the doubt to your friend, even if this was verbatim, it's very easy for a redactor in the Hellenistic period to add this quote into the text of Jeremiah. You understand what I'm saying? It's not. It means nothing, because we see that these texts were constantly. I mean, the form. The Jeremiah, between the Septuagint version of Jeremiah and the Masoretic text of Jeremiah are very, very different. Very different. Also, the length is very different. Not just the location of the chapters is very different, and the length of the text is different. But also, if you compare that to the Qumran version that we found in Qumran of Jeremiah, it is even different than these two. Okay, Jeremiah was still being the text of Jeremiah was still being worked on in the 2nd century, 1st century BCE. Okay, and they moved around verses, they moved around pericopes, they moved around chapters, they moved, they added stuff, they removed stuff. It was still undergoing in the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century BCE, still undergoing addition, redaction, etc. So very easy, if I wanted to make people believe that Genesis was a very ancient text or a very fundamental text to the people, very easy to add quotes into the text of Jeremiah or into the text of Hosea or Joel or whatever, and you can do it in Amos. You can add a something that seems to be a citation from Genesis or Exodus, and then people would say, well, look, Amos knew about this. Now, first of all, if you're approaching this from a scientific perspective, saying that there was a person like Amos is not scientific. Okay, there might have been. I don't really know, but I can't assert that there was. I in my article, I on Amos, and I normally don't. Most of my articles are not on real kind of biblical issues like that, but in this particular article on Amos, I refer to the Amosian school. I'm not talking about a specific person, and I again try to be. When I say scientific, I mean I do not take. I need to have evidence before making a claim. I can't just say, okay, well, the Bible says so, therefore it's historical. And you know what? The Bible never claims to be a book of history. The concept was not even developed yet. So that was not one of its concerns. It was involved in an ideological battle between sects again, just like the Enneads in Rome are not, they don't claim to be actual history. Everyone knew that this is a form of mythology, but they accepted mythology. They had no problem with mythology. Mythology was a form of history. Yeah. And so it's not like today when we equate mythology with lie. It's not a lie. Okay, it is a tradition. Your mythology is your tradition. It is the stories that your ancestors told. It's not a lie. It is a tradition. It is something that's part of your ethnic heritage, right? Your ethnic DNA, or your kind of cultural DNA. And mythology was viewed with high regard. Today we see mythology as something that is a lie, or almost people telling you something in order to, almost a marketing ploy. But that simply was not the case in the ancient world.
Yeah, and it normally represents some truths within it.
There is a grain of truth in every mythology, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, not to, I just thought that was interesting how when I asked that question, it was like it was like I was being rude to them for even questioning that Genesis could be. It was very strange the way it went down, but
People are very emotional about this, of course, and I see it all the time, of course, and I get accused of all kinds of accusations because of this. But I am committed, and I work on this very closely with my students, to being committed to the scientific method of of historical research. And I do not, again, for example, showing that there was a unified Yahwistic identity already in the 6th century, late 7th, as I said earlier today in our discussion. Um, some people see that as being conservative, right? To see, well, there was already a unified kind of quote unquote Jewish identity already that early on. Some people see that as a concern, because it's in scholarship. It's you usually you see Jews as Judean rather than cultic. There was, I mean, the common opinion in scholarship is that there was no cultic unity among Yahwists until when they started to be identified as Jews, which is only in the Asmonean period. Um, and so usually in what's normal in scholarship is to use the word Jews only from the 2nd century BC. And here I say, well, there was, I still don't use the word Jews, but I'm saying there was a common Yahwistic identity that goes way beyond the borders of Judea, already in the 7th and into the 6th century BC, and was very clear from the quote unquote exile on.
and that's another thing is you start seeing synagogues in the Hellenistic era, not before that though.
That's right. That's right. And so, in Jonathan, my friend Jonathan Adler, who's an excellent scholar. I don't know if you've had him already on your show, or if not, you should. But his book, "The Origins of Judaism," is just a great work that describes this very, very clearly from the archaeological. Starting is an archaeologist, so from the archaeological data on how that developed. But yeah, history, actual reality, is much more interesting than the stories that they told you about the Bible. And again, not
It makes me like the Bible more. It does.
exactly. I mean, exactly. Look, I mean, there are a lot of scriptures out there, like the Avesta, the Rig Veda, and the Vedas in general, that are rich, beautiful works. They also have they also interact with historical events. They have beautiful hymns, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work, not less than the Bible. The difference with the Bible is simply its geography, where all of these came together and left their imprint in some way, shape, or form in this region. Just because of where it's located, you had to cross. If you want to go from Egypt to Mesopotamia, you had to cross this area. Or if you wanted to go from Mesopotamia to Egypt, or from Europe to Egypt, as Alexander did, for example, you had to go through this region and leave an imprint. And that's what gives the Bible its unique flavor. But there are a lot of beautiful, scriptural works other than the Bible that exist there. I don't think they are less beautiful and less authoritative. But certainly the Bible is up there, and its uniqueness is just how eclectic it is, right? Conserving elements from all of these empires, from the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Hellenistic empires, plural, into the Roman, and all of these left a mark that is conserved, and you can still hear these echoes in the Bible today. And that's what I think makes it really unique and powerful. Simply, it's humanity.
Well said. I mean, we covered a lot of ground in this discussion, and I just want to, I don't even, that was perfectly well said. We can end on that. And I just want to give you the time to, talk about anything that's coming up that you want to promote. Obviously, you got the book coming out. Anything else besides that?
Well, I have this book coming out. I have a number of books as well, kind of on that I'm finishing now. And I'm writing. I was commissioned to write a book about Elephantine, the history of the Elephantine Yahwistic community there. So they asked me to write that, and that's, I'm already working on that. Of course, that's good. That's a big project, of course, to actually write the history of this absolutely amazing community. The good thing is, of course, I have several articles on this that I can use in this work on this book, and I have these other books that I mentioned throughout our talk today, also about the Alexandria, the Museum in Alexandria and its impact on the biblical evolution of the biblical text and on the composition of the biblical text, putting them together. But really, I think I'm extremely excited about this book that is coming out, Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire, because, of course, it's not just me, it's colleagues that are fantastic that have contributed to this, that were in the conference in 2022. Really, the great scholars. Just so, if you read that book, you get. And by the way, not all of them agree with me, even within the book. and so you can get a glimpse into the discussions. Some of them, disagree with one another, but that's exactly what we wanted to have. We wanted to have all of the different points of view, or at least major points of view, discussing different things together, and really so when you read the different chapters or different contributions in that book, you get a very, very good picture of Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire. And of course, you can agree or disagree with me, or with my colleagues, or with other people there on there. But at least all of us try to make the most scientific arguments we can to support our arguments, support our positions.
I can't wait to see. Do you think this book is going to bring some game changers out, like some stuff that no one's ever, like, this is going to shake things up a little bit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of articles there that are going to really shake things up and open up. I think this book is going to be a reference book for decades, into the future, that all scholars in our field will have to have on their desk.
Yes,
this is going to be a reference book for decades to come.
Is there a way to pre-order it? Can people pre-order it now or no?
I think so. There's already it's already on the De Gruyter website.
Oh, okay. So I'll put the link in the description right now. So people watching this now, pre-order that thing, because this is going to be the book that it's going to change biblical scholarship as we know it. Yeah. And I'm promoting it as much as I can. I think I just promote good stuff. So definitely, I'll put the link in the description. Check that out. And you have just attained true gnosis.